The late afternoon sun cast long golden fingers across the sprawling property, painting the overgrown fields in hues of amber and rust. It was a familiar piece, one that Arthur had come to cherish in the quiet years spent on the land his family had owned for generations. Beside him, trotting with the easy confidence of a king in his domain, was Rex, a magnificent German shepherd whose coal-black nose was always attuned to the shifting currents of their world, whose amber eyes reflected an intelligence that Arthur had come to trust more than his own instincts. Their daily walk was a ritual, a silent conversation held in the language of shared steps and comfortable silence, a meditation that had become as essential to Arthur's well-being as breathing itself. The familiar path wound through tall grass that whispered secrets to the evening breeze, past the weathered fence posts that marked property lines unchanged for decades, and toward the forgotten corners of the estate, where nature had begun to reclaim what man had once carved from her embrace. But today the rhythm was broken. As they neared the old, disused quarry at the edge of the property, a place long since swallowed by ivy and wild brambles, Rex suddenly stopped. His muscular frame went rigid, every fiber of his being focused with laser intensity on something Arthur could not yet perceive. His ears, sharp and alert, swiveled forward like satellite dishes seeking a signal. A low growl rumbled in his chest, not of aggression or fear, but of intense curiosity mixed with an almost protective instinct. And then Arthur heard it too. It was a sound unlike any other, a faint, ethereal melody that seemed to rise from the very stones themselves. It was not the wind sighing through the trees, nor the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. It was a clear, resonant hum, a crystalline song that beckoned from the shadowed mouth of the quarry like a siren's call from another world. Arthur, his instincts honed by years of military service, where survival depended on reading the subtle signs of danger, felt a prickle of caution dance along his spine. But Rex's unwavering focus and the almost reverent way the dog approached the sound pulled him forward. The dog moved with purpose, his powerful shoulders parting the thick curtain of vines to reveal the dark opening that had been hidden for so long. The closer they got, the clearer the sound became, a hauntingly beautiful harmony that vibrated not just in the air, but seemed to resonate in their very bones. A secret the earth had kept for a lifetime, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. This extraordinary discovery is just the beginning of a story about loyalty and confronting the past. Arthur lived a life carved from quiet intention, each day built like a stone wall, brick by careful brick, creating a barrier between himself and the chaos of a world that had once demanded too much of him. After his time in the service, where he had learned that survival often meant making split-second decisions in situations where there was no clear right or wrong, he had returned not to the clamor of the city with its endless noise and demands, but to the gentle seclusion of the countryside that bordered it. Here, in the sturdy farmhouse his parents had left him like a final gift, he had found something he had forgotten existed: peace. The house itself was a testament to simpler times, with thick wooden beams that creaked familiar songs in the wind, wide plank floors worn smooth by generations of feet, and windows that framed the changing seasons like living paintings. His world was one of routine and solitude, a deliberate construction of tranquility, where the loudest sound was often the whistle of wind through the eaves or the distant call of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. He rose with the sun, tended to the small vegetable garden his mother had planted decades ago, and spent his evenings reading by the light of an old lamp that had belonged to his grandfather. In this carefully built sanctuary, Rex was not merely a pet, he was the anchor that held Arthur to the present, a living reminder that life was still worth living, that there was still beauty and loyalty in a world that had shown him far too much of its darker side. He was a silent sentinel during the long nights when memories tried to claw their way to the surface, a steadfast companion on endless walks through fields and forests, where the only battles fought were between growing things competing for sunlight and rain, and a living, breathing testament to unwavering loyalty in a world where such constancy was increasingly rare. Their bond was forged not in words, but in the shared quiet of a sunrise watched from the front porch, the subtle shift in Rex's posture that communicated more than a sentence ever could, and the comforting weight of the dog's head on Arthur's knee, when the past threatened to overwhelm the present. The sprawling acres were their kingdom, a place where the past could be kept at bay by the simple, grounding tasks of mending fences, tending to the garden, and watching the seasons turn in their eternal cycle. It was a fragile piece, perhaps, built on a foundation that Arthur sometimes feared was more wishful thinking than solid ground. But it was theirs, built day by day, moment by moment, on a foundation of mutual trust and an unspoken understanding that they were all each other truly needed in this world. That fragile piece was shattered by the crunch of expensive tires on the gravel drive, a sound as foreign and unwelcome as gunfire in a sanctuary. A sleek, black sedan, its chrome gleaming like a predator's teeth and starkly out of place against the rustic backdrop of the farmhouse, came to a halt with the precision of a man who was accustomed to making dramatic entrances. From it emerged a man Arthur had hoped never to see again, a figure from a past he had worked so hard to bury. Silas. The years had been kind to him in the way that money and power often are, smoothing the rough edges and adding a polish that couldn't quite hide the sharp hunger beneath. He wore his success like a tailored suit, his smile practiced and perfect, his expensive shoes clicking against the gravel with the confidence of a man who believed the world owed him whatever he wanted. But his eyes held the same predatory glint Arthur remembered all too well from nights in foreign deserts, where men like Silas had seen opportunity in every tragedy and profit in every loss. Rex immediately moved to stand between them, his instincts as sharp as they had been in the quarry, positioning himself as a silent, furry wall of suspicion. His body went tense, muscles coiled like springs ready to unleash, and a low growl, barely audible to human ears, rumbled deep in his chest, a warning that Silas was wise enough to heed. The dog's amber eyes never left the intruder, reading him with an accuracy that Arthur had learned to trust implicitly. Silas laughed, a sound that held no warmth, no genuine amusement, just the hollow ring of a man who had practiced charm until it became as artificial as everything else about him. He spoke of their shared past with the casual familiarity of old friends, painting word pictures of a firefight in a forgotten desert where Arthur had pulled him from the wreckage of a burning vehicle, dragging his unconscious body to safety while bullets carved deadly paths through the air around them. But Silas framed the heroic act not as a rescue born of brotherhood and duty, but as a transaction, a debt incurred that now demanded payment. He spoke with casual malice of a missed opportunity during that same chaos, a chance for illicit wealth that Arthur's by-the-book actions and stubborn sense of honor had prevented. There had been a cache, Silas claimed, valuable items that could have disappeared in the confusion of battle, a fortune that could have been theirs if only Arthur had been willing to look the other way, just once. Now Silas claimed with the audacity of a man who had rewritten history to suit his needs, it was time to collect on that perceived debt. He gestured expansively at the land around them, his gaze sweeping over it with a cold, appraising hunger that made Arthur's skin crawl. He offered a pittance for the property, calling it a generous gesture, a chance for Arthur to make things right, and finally pay what he owed. The thinly veiled threat, the arrogant dismissal of his home as mere commodity, and the instinctual, unwavering judgment of the dog at his side solidified Arthur's resolve in a way that surprised him with its fierce intensity. The quiet life he had built was not for sale, especially not to a man who saw honor as a weakness and loyalty as something to be exploited. The unsettling encounter with Silas left a bitter residue in the air, stirring up a past Arthur had worked so hard to lay to rest, like sediment disturbed at the bottom of a still pond. It also ignited a new kind of curiosity, a need to understand what could possibly make his ancestral land so desirable to a man like Silas, whose interest in anything was usually measured solely in dollars and cents. That evening, drawn by a force he couldn't name but felt compelled to follow, Arthur found himself climbing the narrow stairs to the dusty attic, a space he had avoided for years because it held too many memories, too many reminders of the people who were no longer there to share them. The air was thick with dust and the scent of old wood, and shafts of golden light from the setting sun streamed through a small window, illuminating motes that danced like tiny spirits in the stillness. He opened an old wooden trunk that had belonged to his father, a man who had been a quiet amateur geologist, more interested in the stories stones could tell than in any monetary value they might hold, more fascinated by the patient processes that created beauty over millennia than by the quick profits that drove most men. Inside, beneath neatly folded maps that crackled with age and survey equipment that gleamed dully in the fading light, was a series of leather-bound journals. The covers were worn smooth by handling, the leather soft and supple from years of being carried in pockets and backpacks. The pages were brittle with age. The ink faded to a soft brown that spoke of years and seasons and patient observation. But the handwriting was as precise and deliberate as the man who had penned it. Each letter formed with the care of someone who understood that words were vessels for preserving truth. Arthur's fingers traced over intricate drawings of rock formations that seemed to pulse with life on the page, carefully labeled diagrams of the old quarry that revealed depths and complexity he had never imagined, and detailed notes written in his father's familiar, methodical style. Then he saw it. Tucked into a leather pocket at the back of one journal was a hand-drawn map of the quarry, far more detailed than any official survey, showing passages and chambers that no government document had ever recorded. On it, his father had made several cryptic notes that sent a chill of recognition through Arthur's body. He wrote of the sound of the stone, a harmonic resonance, and geological formations that seemed to respond to specific frequencies like living things. But most chilling of all was a stern, underlined warning written in his father's careful script. Nature's beauty is a treasure, not a commodity. Beware the men whose greed makes them deaf to its song. Arthur's heart beat a little faster, the implications crashing over him like a wave. The mysterious singing from the quarry wasn't just a random phenomenon or a trick of the wind through stone. It was his father's secret, a legacy left behind in faded ink and cryptic warnings, a heritage he now felt a profound and urgent need to protect. Night after night, Arthur immersed himself in his father's journals, the soft glow of a brass lamp his only companion besides the ever-watchful Rex, who seemed to sense the importance of these late-night vigils and positioned himself at Arthur's feet like a guardian spirit. The pages transported him back in time, revealing a man he had known and loved, but perhaps never truly understood in all his complexity and passion. His father's entries were filled with a scientist's precision and a poet's soul. Each observation recorded with meticulous care, each discovery celebrated with the joy of a child finding treasure on a beach. He documented his discovery of the strange crystals within the quarry, formations unlike anything he had seen in his decades of amateur geology, which he had named phonoluminescent, for their unique ability to emit both sound and light when stimulated by specific vibrational frequencies. The scientific terms mixed with lyrical descriptions of beauty that took Arthur's breath away. He described spending countless hours in the dark, working by lamplight and moonbeams, experimenting with tuning forks and sound waves, marveling as the cold stone walls came alive with an otherworldly choir and a soft, pulsing light that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the earth itself. He wrote of harmonies that seemed to come from the very soul of the mountain, of colors that had no names in human language, of a beauty so profound it brought tears to his eyes and made him question everything he thought he knew about the boundary between science and magic. But as his excitement grew, documented in increasingly urgent handwriting, so did his apprehension. He understood the scientific significance of what he had found, the potential monetary value of such a discovery, and with the wisdom of a man who had lived through the Depression and 2 wars, he knew exactly what kind of attention that value would bring. He wrote of his growing fear that a discovery of this magnitude would lead to industrial-scale mining, with heavy machinery tearing apart the delicate ecosystem of the surrounding forest and destroying forever the quiet beauty of the land he so deeply loved. He documented his sleepless nights, wrestling with the question of whether mankind had the right to know about every wonder the earth held, or whether some things were meant to remain hidden, protected by silence and solitude. In a final decisive entry dated just months before his death, he had made his choice with the quiet courage that Arthur now recognized as a family trait. He would document his findings for posterity, recording every detail with scientific precision, but would never reveal them to the world at large. He chose to be the silent guardian of the singing stones, preserving their magic over the allure of fame or fortune, choosing protection over profit, wonder over wealth. Reading those words, Arthur felt the weight of that guardianship settle upon his own shoulders like a mantle passed from father to son. This was more than land. It was a sacred trust, a testament to a man who believed some treasures were meant to be protected, not possessed, and who had chosen love over lucre even when no one was watching. Armed with his father's knowledge and a newfound sense of purpose that burned in his chest like a flame that could not be extinguished, Arthur decided it was time to see the secret for himself, to stand where his father had stood and witness the miracle he had died protecting. He and Rex made their way to the quarry in the early morning light, not with the hesitant curiosity of before, but with the careful preparation of an expedition into unknown territory. Arthur carried a backpack filled with the tools his father had used: tuning forks of different pitches, a small hammer, notebooks for recording observations, and a powerful LED flashlight that could illuminate the deepest shadows. Inside the quarry, the air was cool and smelled of damp earth and minerals, of stone and silence, and secrets kept for generations. Arthur switched on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the oppressive darkness like a sword of light, revealing walls that seemed to swallow the illumination and send it back, transformed. And there they were, exactly as his father had described them, but somehow more beautiful than any words could have prepared him for. The walls were laced with veins of pale, blue-green crystals, almost translucent, that glittered like a captured galaxy as the light swept over them, like stars fallen to earth and embedded in stone. They were even more beautiful than his father's meticulous drawings had suggested, possessing a quality of light and color that no pencil could capture, no photograph could preserve. Remembering the journal entries and his father's careful instructions, Arthur took a steel mallet from his pack and gently tapped a nearby rock face, creating a clear, ringing tone that echoed off the walls and seemed to hang in the air for longer than physics should have allowed. For a moment there was silence, a held breath, a pause between worlds. Then, as if answering a call that had been waiting decades to be heard, a low hum began to emanate from a cluster of crystals deep within the cavern, a note so pure it seemed to come from the throat of an angel. Another tap, at a slightly different pitch, and more crystals joined in, their individual notes weaving together into a complex, ethereal chord that filled the space with sound so beautiful it seemed to redefine the very concept of music. As the sound swelled and grew, a soft, internal light began to pulse from within the crystalline structures, bathing the dark space in an enchanting, blue-green glow that made everything look like it was underwater in the most beautiful ocean ever imagined. It was a symphony of light and sound, a private concert performed by the earth itself, a miracle that belonged to no one and everyone all at once. Throughout it all, Rex sat perfectly still, his head cocked at an attentive angle, not with alarm or confusion, but with a quiet, attentive wonder that mirrored Arthur's own amazement. The dog seemed to understand instinctively that they were in the presence of something ancient and magical, a secret worth keeping, a treasure that transcended any human concept of value. The discovery solidified Arthur's resolve, but it also filled him with a sense of urgency that pressed against his chest like a physical weight. He knew he couldn't protect this secret alone, not against a man as relentless and ruthless as Silas, whose resources and connections far exceeded anything Arthur could muster. Following a name mentioned in his father's notes, A colleague from decades past who had shared his passion for the hidden wonders of the earth, he found and contacted Evelyn, a young, brilliant geologist whose grandfather had been a longtime friend and fellow rockhound of Arthur's father. Over the phone, her initial skepticism, the careful professional doubt of a scientist trained to question everything, gave way to breathless excitement as Arthur described the phonoluminescent crystals in terms that only someone who had actually seen them could use. Her voice trembled with barely contained enthusiasm as she grasped the implications, and she agreed to come at once, canceling other commitments and rearranging her schedule with the urgency of someone who understood that some opportunities came only once in a lifetime. Her voice buzzed with the thrill of a potential world-altering discovery, the kind that redefined textbooks and opened entirely new fields of research. But as one door of hope opened, another threat loomed on the horizon like a storm cloud gathering strength. Silas, true to his nature and with the patience of a predator who understood that the best attacks came from unexpected angles, began his campaign of whispers and lies. He spread rumors throughout the small community on the city's edge, planting seeds of doubt and suspicion with the skill of someone who had made character assassination into an art form. He painted Arthur as an unstable recluse, a veteran whose mind was fractured by the past and prone to wild fantasies, a man who saw enemies where none existed and treasures where there was only empty stone. The tactic was insidious and effective, designed to isolate Arthur and discredit him before he could even present his case, to make his voice meaningless by destroying his credibility. The threat was no longer just a legal or financial one. It was becoming deeply personal and tangible, a web closing around him with each passing day. One morning, as the dew still sparkled on the grass and the air held the crisp promise of autumn, Arthur found what he had begun to dread, but somehow knew was inevitable. Near the fence line bordering the quarry, partially hidden in the tall grass that swayed in the morning breeze, were fresh boot prints that were definitely not his own. The impressions were deep and clear, made by expensive shoes with a distinctive tread pattern that spoke of urban sidewalks rather than country paths. Beside them lay a half-smoked cigarette, the expensive imported brand he knew Silas favored, still faintly warm to the touch as if it had been discarded only minutes before. Rex, sniffing the ground with his nose pressed close to the earth, a low, menacing growl building in his throat, confirmed Arthur's worst fears with the accuracy of a detective who never made mistakes. They were being watched. The enemy had moved from threats and lawsuits to active surveillance, and the battle for the land had begun in earnest, with the first shots already fired in a war Arthur had never wanted, but now found himself fighting whether he chose to or not. The psychological warfare was soon followed by a formal declaration of hostilities that arrived with all the pomp and circumstance of a legal document, but carried the personal venom of a blood feud. A few days later, a courier in a crisp uniform delivered a thick manila envelope with Arthur's name written in letters that seemed to carry their own weight of doom. Inside was a lawsuit, a stack of papers filled with dense legal jargon that made Arthur's head spin and his stomach clench with a dread that was part anger and part disbelief. The document was a masterpiece of malicious fiction, crafted with the skill of expensive lawyers who specialized in making lies sound like truth and turning black into white through the alchemy of legal language. In it, Silas claimed that during their time in the service, they had made a verbal agreement, a soldier's pact, sealed in blood and brotherhood, to share any significant assets or discoveries they might make in their civilian lives. He twisted the story of his rescue, that moment of split-second heroism when Arthur had risked his own life to pull a fellow soldier from burning wreckage, portraying it as the sealing of this mythical pact rather than what it actually was, one human being saving another without thought of reward or recognition. Now he claimed that the land Arthur inherited, and any mineral rights associated with it, were half his by right, stolen from him by Arthur's selfish hoarding of family assets. It was a brazen, audacious lie, but one wrapped in the intimidating authority of a legal filing, supported by affidavits from men Arthur didn't recognize, backed by the weight of a legal system that he had never learned to navigate. The lawsuit demanded an immediate injunction to prevent Arthur from selling, altering, or in any way changing the property, and sought a court order to grant Silas full access for assessment and evaluation purposes, which Arthur knew was simply legal language for giving the enemy permission to rape and pillage everything his family had protected for generations. Arthur felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach, a sensation he recognized from combat but had hoped never to feel again. This was a battlefield he was unfamiliar with, a war fought not with courage and skill and the clear understanding of right and wrong, but with motions, depositions, and the crushing weight of legal fees that could bleed a man dry without ever giving him a chance to fire a shot in his own defense. Silas knew Arthur didn't have the resources for a protracted court battle, didn't have the connections or the war chest necessary to fight a man with unlimited money and flexible morals. It was a calculated move designed to bleed him dry slowly, to force him to surrender not with the honest defeat of a battle lost fairly, but with the slow, relentless drain of his life savings and the grinding exhaustion of a system designed to favor those who could afford to game it. The quiet sanctuary he had built was now under siege, and Arthur could feel the walls closing in with each passing hour. Just as the weight of the lawsuit began to feel unbearable, pressing down on Arthur's shoulders like a physical burden that made it hard to breathe, Evelyn arrived like a breath of fresh air in a stifling room. She was a whirlwind of youthful energy and sharp intellect, her eyes bright with curiosity and her movements quick and purposeful. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had spent her life asking questions and finding answers, whose very presence seemed to push back against the darkness that had been gathering around Arthur like storm clouds. Her eyes lit up with an almost reverent awe as Arthur showed her the entrance to the quarry, and he could see her scientific mind already working, cataloging observations and forming hypotheses even before they reached the crystals themselves. Once inside, her professionalism took over, and she transformed from an excited young woman into a focused researcher with a job to do. With specialized equipment pulled from a series of metal cases, instruments that beeped and hummed and cast their own small lights in the darkness, she ran a series of preliminary tests. Arthur watched as she took measurements, collected samples, and recorded readings with the methodical precision of someone who understood that science was built on careful observation and patient documentation. Her excitement grew with each reading, with each confirmation that what she was seeing was real and unprecedented and potentially world-changing. Her conclusion was swift and certain, delivered with the authority of someone whose expertise was unquestionable. The crystals were not only real, but represented a geological anomaly of immense scientific and commercial value, a discovery that would rewrite textbooks and launch 1,000 research projects. She confirmed that this discovery would be world news, would bring Arthur fame and fortune beyond his wildest dreams, but also stressed with growing urgency that Silas's lawsuit was a grave and immediate threat. He could use the legal system to tie them up in court for years, filing motion after motion, demanding delay after delay, all while potentially gaining access to the quarry through legal maneuvering to plunder it before the case was ever resolved. They needed irrefutable, third-party verified proof to present to a judge, evidence so compelling and documentation so thorough that even the most corrupt court would have no choice but to throw out the baseless lawsuit and recognize Arthur's rightful ownership. Their conversation was cut short by a blaring alert from Evelyn's phone, a sound so harsh and urgent it made them both jump. A severe weather warning, the kind that sent smart people running for shelter and made even experienced meteorologists nervous. A massive storm system, brewing for days over the ocean, had suddenly shifted course with the unpredictability of nature at her most dangerous and was now barreling directly toward them like a freight train loaded with destruction. The forecast predicted torrential rain that would turn every stream into a raging river, gale-force winds that could topple century-old trees, and a high risk of flash floods and landslides that could reshape the very landscape they were trying to protect, all expected to hit within the next 24 hours. A new, more powerful enemy had entered the fray, one that couldn't be bought, threatened, or reasoned with. They were now in a desperate race against two clocks, the slow, grinding gears of the legal system that could drag on for years, and the furious, unstoppable advance of nature herself, who recognized no human law and respected no human timeline. They had to get their proof now, had to document everything and get out before the storm hit, or risk losing everything to forces far more destructive than any human enemy could ever be. Time was their most ruthless enemy now, counting down with the merciless precision of a bomb timer as Arthur, Evelyn, and Rex prepared to venture into the quarry under increasingly ominous skies. The horizon had transformed into a bruised canvas of purple and black, with clouds rolling in like an advancing army, their bellies heavy with the promise of destruction. The air itself felt charged with electricity, making the hair on their arms stand up and causing Rex to pace nervously, his instincts reading the atmospheric pressure changes long before human instruments could register them. Arthur moved with the practiced efficiency of a soldier preparing for battle, checking and double-checking their equipment, waterproof cases for Evelyn's delicate instruments, emergency flares in case they became separated, rope and climbing gear in case the storm altered the terrain, and enough food and water to last them through the night if the worst happened. Evelyn worked alongside him with scientific precision, calibrating her equipment and running final diagnostics on instruments that represented years of technological advancement and tens of thousands of dollars in research funding. Rex positioned himself at the quarry entrance, his powerful frame silhouetted against the darkening sky, serving as both sentry and early warning system for the approaching storm. The wind had begun to pick up, sending leaves swirling through the air like nature's confetti, and in the distance, the first rumble of thunder announced that their window of opportunity was closing faster than they had hoped. Arthur felt the familiar sensation of time compression that he remembered from combat situations, where minutes seemed to stretch and contract simultaneously, where every decision carried weight and every moment of hesitation could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. As they descended into the quarry, their flashlight beams cutting through air that seemed thicker than usual, Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into more than just a cave. They were entering a race against time itself, with stakes that went far beyond money or property rights to encompass everything his father had died protecting, and everything Arthur had learned to value in his quiet years of healing. The storm arrived like a wild animal unleashed from captivity, far ahead of the meteorologist's predictions, and with a fury that seemed almost personal in its intensity. What had been a gentle breeze when they entered the quarry had transformed into a howling gale that bent trees until their trunks creaked ominously and sent debris flying through the air like shrapnel from an unseen explosion. The rain began as fat droplets that splattered against the rocks with sounds like gunshots, but within minutes it had escalated into a deluge that turned the world outside the quarry into a gray curtain of water so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Arthur watched from the mouth of the quarry as rivulets of muddy water began cascading down the hillside, carving new channels in soil that had been stable for decades and turning the familiar landscape into something alien and dangerous. The sound was overwhelming, a constant roar that made communication difficult and filled the air with a vibration that seemed to penetrate their bones. Rex whined softly, his ears flattened against his head, not from fear, but from the sensory overload of sounds and smells and atmospheric changes that his heightened senses processed far more acutely than his human companions. Evelyn tried to continue her work, but the electromagnetic interference from the storm was playing havoc with her sensitive instruments, causing readings to fluctuate wildly and making accurate measurements nearly impossible. Then came the sound that chilled Arthur's blood. A deep, rumbling groan from somewhere up the hillside, followed by a crash that shook the ground beneath their feet. Through the gray curtain of rain, they could see a dark mass sliding down the slope, gathering speed and size as it went. A landslide, triggered by the sudden saturation of soil that had been stable for years, was heading directly toward the quarry entrance. Arthur grabbed Evelyn's arm and pulled her deeper into the cave as tons of mud, rocks, and uprooted trees slammed into the opening with the force of a freight train. When the rumbling finally stopped and the dust settled, they found themselves staring at a wall of debris that had completely sealed them inside. The cheerful entrance that had welcomed them just hours before was now nothing more than a memory. Buried under what looked like half the hillside, they were trapped, cut off from the outside world, with only the supplies they had brought and whatever air remained in the cavern to sustain them until rescue could arrive. Arthur's military training kicked in with the automatic response of muscle memory, his mind shifting from civilian panic to soldier pragmatism in the space of a heartbeat. He conducted a quick inventory of their situation with the methodical thoroughness that had kept him alive in far worse circumstances than this. They had enough food and water for perhaps 12 hours if they were careful, enough battery power in their flashlights and equipment for maybe 6 hours of continuous use, and enough warm clothing to survive the dropping temperature that always accompanied being underground for extended periods. The air supply was his biggest concern. Without proper ventilation, carbon dioxide could build up to dangerous levels, and there was no way to know how much oxygen was available in the sealed chamber. But Arthur had survived in worse conditions with less equipment, and he had advantages that his younger self would never have imagined. The unwavering loyalty of Rex, whose wilderness instincts were far sharper than any human survival training, and the scientific expertise of Evelyn, whose knowledge of geology might be the key to finding another way out. He organized their limited supplies with military precision, setting up a base camp in the driest part of the cavern and establishing protocols for conserving battery life and managing their water supply. Rex immediately appointed himself as their scout, his keen nose exploring every corner of the cavern, his acute hearing monitoring for sounds that might indicate other passages or changes in their situation. Evelyn, after the initial shock wore off, threw herself into studying the cave structure with the focused intensity of someone who understood that science might be their salvation. She began mapping the cavern system, using her instruments to measure depth and density of the surrounding rock, looking for weaknesses or natural formations that might offer an escape route. Arthur found himself oddly calm, the familiar sensation of being in a survival situation somehow easier to handle than the legal and emotional uncertainties that had been plaguing him for weeks. Hours passed in the strange twilight of their underground prison, marked only by the steady drain of their flashlight batteries and the gradual cooling of the air around them. They had settled into a routine born of necessity. Evelyn worked on her geological surveys, Arthur managed their supplies and monitored their physical condition, and Rex continued his patient exploration of every crack and crevice in their stone cage. It was during one of these explorations that Rex made a discovery that would change everything. In a section of the cavern they had initially dismissed as a dead end, behind a curtain of fallen stones that looked like permanent decoration, Rex began exhibiting behavior that Arthur had learned never to ignore. The dog's nose was pressed against what appeared to be solid rock, but his tail was wagging with the excitement of a detective who had found a crucial clue. Arthur approached cautiously, playing his flashlight beam over the area that had captured Rex's attention. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the rough texture of natural stone formation that had been carved by water over millennia. But as he looked closer, following the direction of Rex's intense focus, he began to notice subtle differences in the rock face. There were hairline cracks that seemed to follow unnatural patterns, shadows that suggested depth rather than solid stone, and most importantly, Rex was reacting to something his human senses couldn't detect. Air movement. There was a breeze coming from somewhere behind that wall, so faint that only the dog's sensitive nose could pick it up, but strong enough to carry scents from the world beyond their prison. Arthur called Evelyn over, and together they began to examine the wall more carefully. What they found sent a surge of hope through their desperate situation. Hidden behind centuries of mineral deposits and casual rock falls was the entrance to what appeared to be another passage, a natural tunnel that had been formed by underground water flow, but had been sealed by time and geological processes. It wasn't large, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, and there was no way to know where it led or whether it would provide a real escape route. But it was hope, and in their current situation, hope was more valuable than gold. The passage that Rex had discovered turned out to be part of a network that Arthur's father had never documented, a hidden system of natural tunnels and chambers that had been carved by underground streams over thousands of years. As they worked to clear the entrance, removing loose stones and centuries of accumulated debris, Arthur couldn't help but think of his father's journals and wonder what other secrets the land held that had never been recorded in any scientific study. The work was slow and dangerous, with the constant risk that their excavation might trigger another collapse, but it was also their only realistic chance of escape. Evelyn provided scientific guidance, using her knowledge of rock formation and structural geology to identify which stones could be safely removed and which ones were providing crucial support. Arthur did the heavy lifting, his military fitness and combat experience serving him well in the confined space and difficult conditions. Rex served as their early warning system, his sensitive hearing alert for any sounds that might indicate shifting rock or approaching danger. The tunnel beyond was narrow and treacherous, carved by water into smooth curves that made progress difficult and visibility limited. They were forced to crawl single file, with Rex leading the way, because his senses were better adapted to the dark, confined environment. Arthur came next, dragging their emergency supplies and maintaining contact with both Rex ahead and Evelyn behind. The air was stale and cold, carrying strange odors of minerals and underground water, but it was definitely moving, which meant there was an opening somewhere ahead. Progress was measured in feet rather than miles, with frequent stops to rest and assess their situation. But after what felt like hours of crawling through the bowels of the earth, Rex's excited barking ahead signaled that their faith in his instincts had been justified. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and beyond that, Arthur could see something that made his heart leap with relief. Natural light filtering down from somewhere above, faint but unmistakable evidence that they had found their way back to the surface world. The chamber they emerged into was unlike anything Arthur had expected. A natural cathedral carved from living rock with walls that seemed to sparkle in the dim light filtering from above. But more importantly, it was clearly part of a different section of the quarry system, one that had remained open to the surface despite the landslide that had trapped them. As they climbed toward the light, following a natural chimney in the rock that had been formed by geological processes beyond Arthur's understanding, he realized they were emerging on the far side of his property, in an area he had rarely explored because it was difficult to reach and seemed to offer nothing of interest. The storm was still raging above, but with less intensity than before, and they were able to find shelter under an overhang of rock that protected them from the worst of the weather. But their relief at escaping the underground trap was short-lived, because as they caught their breath and assessed their situation, Arthur heard something that made his blood run cold. Voices carried on the wind, men's voices speaking in low, urgent tones. Peering carefully around the edge of their shelter, Arthur could see lights moving in the darkness, flashlight beams cutting through the rain as figures in dark clothing picked their way across the storm-damaged landscape. Even through the curtain of rain and at a distance of several hundred yards, Arthur recognized one of the figures immediately. Silas had not come alone to check on the results of the landslide, and the men with him moved with the purposeful efficiency of professionals rather than the casual curiosity of concerned neighbors. They were here to make sure there were no survivors to tell the story of what had really happened, to confirm that nature had solved Silas's problem more efficiently than any lawyer ever could have. Arthur realized with crystal clarity that their escape from the underground trap had only delivered them into a more dangerous situation. They were exposed, outnumbered, and facing an enemy who had clearly decided that subtlety was no longer necessary. The reality of their situation hit Arthur like a physical blow as he crouched in the darkness, watching the purposeful movement of armed men through the storm-torn landscape. They were no longer dealing with a legal dispute or even a personal vendetta. This had escalated into something far more deadly. Silas had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, moving from intimidation and lawsuits to what could only be described as attempted murder. The landslide that had trapped them wasn't just an unfortunate consequence of the storm. It had been triggered deliberately, timed perfectly to coincide with their presence in the quarry. Arthur's mind raced through the implications as he watched Silas directing his men with hand signals, their movements coordinated and professional in a way that suggested military or mercenary training. These weren't local thugs hired for intimidation. They were killers. And Arthur found himself facing the kind of life-or-death situation he had hoped never to encounter again after leaving the service. Evelyn huddled beside him, her scientific equipment forgotten as the reality of their danger penetrated her academic worldview and confronted her with a brutality she had never imagined. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, the early signs of panic that Arthur recognized from his own experience with combat stress, but he couldn't spare the time to comfort her properly. Rex positioned himself between his human companions and the approaching threat, his body tense and ready, every instinct honed by generations of breeding focused on the protection of his pack. The dog's silence was more ominous than any growl. He understood intuitively that sound would betray their position and that their survival depended on remaining hidden until they could find a way to escape or fight back. Arthur felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, the burden of protecting others in a situation where there were no good choices, only degrees of risk and potential sacrifice. The storm that had seemed like their enemy was now their ally, providing cover and masking sounds that might otherwise give away their position, but it also limited their options for escape and made communication nearly impossible. The minutes stretched into an eternity as Arthur weighed their options with the cold calculation of a man who had learned to make life-and-death decisions under pressure. They could try to escape through the wilderness, but Evelyn was injured from their underground ordeal, slowing their progress and leaving a trail that professional trackers could follow even in the storm. They could attempt to hide until the searchers gave up, but Arthur knew from the methodical way Silas's men were conducting their sweep that these weren't amateurs who would be discouraged by bad weather or difficult terrain. Their only real option was to fight, but the odds were heavily stacked against them. 3 civilians, one of them injured, against what appeared to be at least 4 armed professionals with superior equipment and the advantage of numbers. Arthur's military training provided him with tactical knowledge and combat experience, but he was older now, out of practice, and burdened with the responsibility of protecting 2 people who had no experience with violence. Rex was a formidable ally, trained and bred for protection, but even the most capable dog was vulnerable to firearms in the hands of determined killers. As Arthur considered their desperate situation, he found himself drawing on reserves of courage and determination he had thought were buried with his military service. The quiet, peaceful man who tended his garden and read by lamplight was still there, but underneath was the soldier who had faced death before and survived by being smarter, tougher, and more determined than his enemies. He thought of his father's journals, of the decades of protection and secrecy that had preserved the Crystal Cave's secret, of the trust that had been passed down to him and that he had sworn to honor. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice, about standing up to bullies who believed that money and violence could override right and wrong, about proving that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. Arthur felt a calm settle over him, the strange peace that sometimes came in the moments before battle, when all the uncertainty was stripped away, and there was only the clarity of purpose and the simple choice between standing and falling. In that moment of crystalline clarity, Arthur made his decision with the quiet confidence of a man who had finally found his battlefield. He couldn't protect the people he loved by running, couldn't preserve his father's legacy by hiding, couldn't honor the trust that had been placed in him by cowering in the shadows while evil men destroyed everything good in the world. He leaned close to Evelyn, whispering instructions that were barely audible over the storm, but carried the weight of absolute command. She would stay hidden with the emergency supplies, using her cell phone to call for help if she could get a signal, but under no circumstances was she to reveal her position or attempt to help in the coming fight. Her survival was crucial, not just as a human being worthy of protection, but as the only witness who could tell the truth about what Silas had done and ensure that justice would eventually be served. Rex understood without words what was required of him. The bond between man and dog had reached a level where communication transcended language, where shared purpose made explanation unnecessary. They would face this threat together, as they had faced every challenge in their years of companionship, with absolute trust and mutual protection as their guiding principles. Arthur checked his limited weapons. A hunting knife that had belonged to his grandfather, a heavy flashlight that could serve as a club, and stones that could be thrown with accuracy if the situation required it. It wasn't much against professional killers with modern firearms, but it would have to be enough. He thought briefly of the irony that after years of seeking peace and quiet, he was about to engage in the most desperate battle of his life, not for country or cause or ideology, but for the simple right to protect what belonged to him and the people he loved. The storm continued to rage around them, nature's fury providing a soundtrack for human conflict. But Arthur no longer felt like a victim of circumstances beyond his control. He had chosen his ground, accepted his odds, and committed himself to a course of action that would either save them all or ensure that their deaths would not go unavenged. Rex moved like a shadow made flesh, his powerful frame flowing through the darkness with the silent precision of a predator returning to his ancestral purpose. The years of domestic comfort had not dulled his instincts. If anything, they had sharpened them, giving him something precious to protect, and a master whose safety was worth any sacrifice. Arthur watched with professional admiration as the dogs circled wide around their position, using the storm and the broken terrain to approach Silas's men from an unexpected angle. Rex understood the tactics of warfare in ways that no human training could have taught him, relying on senses that evolution had honed over millions of years, and instincts that were older than civilization itself. The first man never knew what hit him. One moment he was sweeping his flashlight beam across the rocky ground, searching methodically for signs of survivors from the landslide, and the next he was face down in the mud with 120 pounds of fury standing on his back and teeth that could crush bone pressed against his throat. Rex's attack was swift, silent, and absolutely controlled. He disabled without killing, neutralized the threat without unnecessary violence, demonstrating a level of tactical sophistication that would have impressed professional soldiers. The man's weapon disappeared into the darkness, claimed by Arthur, who had used Rex's assault as a distraction to close the distance and secure the equipment they needed to even the odds. The second man turned at his partner's muffled cry, but Arthur was already moving, using techniques learned in a dozen different conflicts to close with an enemy before he could bring his weapons to bear. The fight was brief and vicious, a scrambling encounter in the mud and rain where superior training and desperate determination overcame youth and arrogance. When it was over, Arthur had a modern assault rifle and enough ammunition to make the remaining searchers think twice about their casual approach to mass murder. Rex appeared at his side, uninjured but alert, his amber eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a job well done and the readiness to do whatever was required next. 2 down, but at least 2 more to go, including Silas himself. And Arthur knew that the easy victories were behind them now. The tide of battle shifted as Arthur claimed the high ground, positioning himself among the rocky outcroppings that provided both cover and commanding views of the approaches to their position. He had the tactical advantage now, with superior weapons and the element of surprise partially restored. But he also knew that Silas wouldn't make the same mistakes his subordinates had made. The man was ruthless and calculating, willing to sacrifice his hired help to achieve his objectives, and Arthur could see him repositioning his remaining forces with the cold precision of someone who treated human lives as expendable resources. The storm was beginning to weaken, which meant their window of concealment was shrinking. But it also meant that Evelyn might be able to get a cell phone signal to call for help. Arthur used hand signals to direct Rex to a new position, creating a crossfire that would make any frontal assault prohibitively expensive, while keeping his own location flexible enough to avoid being pinned down by superior numbers. The next phase of the engagement was a deadly game of cat and mouse, with both sides maneuvering for advantage, while the storm provided intermittent cover and confusion. Arthur found himself drawing on every lesson he had learned in his military service, every tactical principle and combat technique that had been drilled into him during years of training and months of actual warfare. But this was different from anything he had faced before, because he wasn't fighting for abstract concepts like freedom or democracy or political ideology. He was fighting for his home, his heritage, and the people he loved, which gave him a strength and determination that went beyond professional competence or patriotic duty. Rex proved to be an invaluable ally, using his superior senses to provide early warning of enemy movements and his natural stealth to harass and confuse opponents who had no effective counter to a highly intelligent predator operating in familiar territory. The dog seemed to understand that this wasn't a game or training exercise, that the stakes were absolute and the consequences of failure were unthinkable. Together, they created a defensive perimeter that was far more effective than their numbers suggested, turning their disadvantage in firepower into an advantage in mobility and local knowledge. As the storm began to subside and visibility improved, Arthur could see that their situation remained desperate, despite their tactical successes. Silas had pulled back his remaining forces and was clearly preparing for a final, coordinated assault that would overwhelm their defenses through sheer firepower and professional execution. Arthur counted at least 3 more armed figures moving to surround their position, plus Silas himself directing operations from what he thought was a safe distance. The mathematics of combat were unforgiving. No matter how skilled or determined Arthur and Rex might be, they couldn't hold out indefinitely against superior numbers and equipment. But they had achieved something crucial. They had bought time, and time was the one resource that favored their cause rather than their enemies. Somewhere in the distance, Arthur could hear the faint sound of sirens approaching, growing stronger despite the residual noise of the storm. Evelyn had managed to get through to emergency services, and help was on the way. The question now was whether they could survive long enough for rescue to arrive, and whether the authorities would be able to sort out the truth from whatever lies Silas had prepared to explain the night's events. Arthur felt a grim satisfaction in knowing that whatever happened next, Silas's carefully constructed facade of respectability was about to crumble. There would be too many witnesses, too much evidence, too many questions for even the most expensive lawyers to explain away. The man had finally overreached himself, allowing greed and hatred to push him into actions that couldn't be covered up or rationalized. But that future vindication would be meaningless if Arthur and his companions didn't survive the next few minutes. Silas clearly understood that his only chance now was to eliminate all witnesses and create a story that cast himself as the victim rather than the perpetrator. Arthur could see the desperation in the man's movements, the reckless aggression of someone who knew he was cornered and had nothing left to lose. The final confrontation came with the sudden violence of a thunderclap, as Silas abandoned all pretense of subtlety and ordered a direct assault on Arthur's position. The remaining mercenaries opened fire with automatic weapons, sending streams of bullets whining off the rocks and filling the air with the deadly buzz of high-velocity projectiles seeking flesh and bone. Arthur responded with controlled bursts from his captured weapon, using his superior position and knowledge of the terrain to make every shot count, while conserving ammunition for the prolonged fight he knew was coming. Rex disappeared into the shadows like a ghost, his dark coat making him nearly invisible in the dim light as he moved to flank their attackers and create chaos in their rear areas. The sound of gunfire echoed across the storm-damaged landscape, punctuated by shouts of command and the occasional cry of pain as Arthur's accurate shooting found its mark. But he was being steadily pushed back by the volume of fire, forced to abandon one position after another as his enemies closed the range and brought their superior firepower to bear. The circle was tightening, and Arthur knew that within minutes he would be forced into a final stand with no room for maneuver and no hope of escape. It was then that Rex emerged from the darkness behind Silas, like an avenging angel, his powerful jaws closing on the man's gun arm with the crushing force that had been bred into his bloodline for generations of protection work. Silas screamed and dropped his weapon, but Rex wasn't finished with him. Years of quiet loyalty had been transformed into righteous fury, and the dog's attack was both controlled and devastating, designed to disable rather than kill, but leaving no doubt about who was the dominant predator in this encounter. The sight of their leader being mauled by what they had dismissed as a mere pet broke the morale of the remaining mercenaries, who suddenly found themselves facing not just a skilled opponent with superior position, but a tactical situation that had spiraled completely out of their control. The approaching sirens were getting louder, the sound of multiple emergency vehicles converging on their location, and Arthur could see the first flashing lights beginning to penetrate the darkness between the trees. The arrival of Sheriff Miller and his deputies marked the end of the violence but the beginning of a different kind of battle. One fought with words and evidence rather than bullets and blood. Arthur found himself trying to explain a situation that sounded like fiction, even to his own ears. A conspiracy involving attempted murder, illegal mining operations, and a geological discovery that could change the scientific understanding of crystalline formations. But the evidence was overwhelming, from the weapons and equipment left behind by Silas's mercenaries to the testimony of Evelyn, who had witnessed everything from her hiding place and recorded crucial parts of the confrontation on her cell phone. Rex, still maintaining his protective stance over the subdued Silas, had become a living symbol of loyalty and justice that even the most skeptical observer couldn't dismiss. The dog's controlled aggression and precise timing had saved not only Arthur's life, but potentially the lives of everyone involved, demonstrating a level of tactical intelligence that bordered on the supernatural. As EMTs treated the wounded and investigators began documenting the scene, Arthur felt a strange sense of completion, as if a circle that had been opened years ago was finally being closed. The quiet man who had sought nothing more than peace and solitude had been transformed back into a warrior. But this time he had fought for something entirely his own, rather than for abstract political goals or military objectives. He had protected his heritage, his home, and his friends through a combination of courage, skill, and the unwavering loyalty of a partner who asked for nothing more than the chance to serve. Silas, his arm in a splint and his face pale with shock and pain, was led away in handcuffs while investigators photographed the scene and collected evidence that would ensure his conviction on multiple felony charges. The man who had thought himself above the law because of his wealth and connections had discovered that justice, while sometimes delayed, was never permanently denied to those with the courage to stand up and fight for what was right. The aftermath of the confrontation brought a reckoning that extended far beyond the immediate participants, as the full scope of Silas's criminal enterprise was revealed through forensic investigation and witness testimony. The attempted murder charges were only the beginning. Investigators uncovered evidence of fraud, extortion, illegal mining operations, and a pattern of intimidation that had victimized dozens of property owners throughout the region. Arthur found himself at the center of a media storm that he neither wanted nor enjoyed, but he understood that publicity was the price of justice and that his story might prevent similar crimes against other families. Evelyn's scientific documentation of the phonoluminescent crystals became the foundation for a major research project, funded by the government and several universities, that would ensure the quarry's protection while advancing human understanding of geological phenomena. The land that Arthur's father had died protecting was now formally designated as a national scientific preserve, guaranteeing that future generations would be able to study and appreciate its wonders without fear of commercial exploitation. Rex, who had become something of a celebrity in his own right, seemed largely indifferent to the attention, content to resume his quiet life as Arthur's companion and protector. The dog's heroic actions had been recognized officially, with commendations from law enforcement and scientific organizations, but Arthur knew that Rex's greatest reward was simply the restoration of the peaceful existence they had built together. The legal battles that followed were lengthy and complex, but they ended with complete vindication for Arthur and severe sentences for Silas and his accomplices. More importantly, they established legal precedents that would make it much more difficult for wealthy criminals to use the court system as a weapon against honest citizens. Arthur watched the proceedings with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness, knowing that justice had been served but regretting the violence that had been necessary to achieve it. He had hoped never to kill again after leaving military service, and while he had acted in self-defense and in protection of others, he carried the weight of those actions as he carried all the memories of his past conflicts. 6 months after the storm that had changed everything, Arthur stood at the entrance to the quarry that was no longer his alone, but belonged to science, to the future, and to a world that was still learning to understand the wonders it contained. The legal machinery had finally ground to its inevitable conclusion, with Silas facing decades in federal prison for attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud, and a dozen other charges that his expensive lawyers had been powerless to dismiss or reduce. The evidence had been overwhelming, from the testimony of his own hired mercenaries who had turned state's evidence in exchange for reduced sentences, to the forensic analysis of the explosives used to trigger the landslide, to the recorded conversations Evelyn had captured during their underground ordeal. Justice had been swift and thorough once the full scope of Silas's crimes became apparent to investigators who found a pattern of similar schemes stretching back years, involving dozens of families who had been intimidated, threatened, and cheated out of their property rights. Arthur felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that those other victims would finally receive compensation and that future families would be protected by the legal precedents established during the prosecution. But more than the courtroom victory, more than the financial settlements and the formal vindication, what mattered to Arthur was the restoration of peace to his corner of the world. The community that had once whispered about his stability and questioned his grip on reality now spoke of him with respect and admiration, understanding finally that he had been the target of a sophisticated criminal conspiracy rather than the victim of post-combat psychological trauma. Neighbors who had avoided him during the worst of Silas's smear campaign now stopped by regularly, bringing homemade food and offering assistance with projects around the property. Sarah, the little girl who lived nearby and had always been fond of Rex, had become something of an unofficial guardian of the scientific preserve, leading school groups on tours and explaining the crystal formations with the enthusiasm of someone who had grown up hearing the story of their discovery. The land itself seemed to have healed from the violence it had witnessed, with new growth covering the scars left by the landslide and the quarry entrance restored to safe accessibility by a team of engineers who understood both the scientific value of the site and the historical significance of preserving it exactly as Arthur's father had intended. The transformation in Arthur himself was perhaps the most remarkable change of all, though it had happened so gradually that he barely noticed it until one morning when he looked in the mirror and realized that the haunted look he had carried for years had been replaced by something he had almost forgotten. Peace. Not the fragile, defensive peace he had constructed through isolation and routine, but a deeper serenity that came from having faced his worst fears and emerged victorious through courage rather than avoidance. The nightmares that had plagued him since his military service had not disappeared entirely, but they had lost their power to control his waking hours, replaced by dreams of crystal songs and underground adventures that reminded him of wonder rather than horror. He understood now that his father's decision to protect the quarry had not been about hiding from the world, but about preserving something precious until the world was ready to appreciate it properly. The years of quiet solitude had not been a retreat from life, but a preparation for the moment when he would be called upon to defend what mattered most. His military service, which he had seen as a burden and a source of trauma, had given him the skills and strength necessary to protect his heritage when peaceful methods proved insufficient. The man who had once defined himself by what he had lost in war now understood himself as someone who had been shaped by conflict into a guardian of peace and beauty. Arthur's relationship with his past had been fundamentally altered by the events of that terrible night, not through forgetting or denial, but through integration and purpose. He was no longer a victim of his experiences, but a beneficiary of them. Someone who had learned hard lessons that enabled him to stand firm when standing was required. The soldier and the civilian were no longer at war within him. They had become partners in the service of something larger than either could achieve alone. He found himself sleeping better, laughing more easily, and engaging with the world around him with an openness that would have been impossible during his years of self-imposed exile. Rex, ever sensitive to his master's emotional state, had relaxed as well, no longer maintaining the hyper-vigilant watch that had characterized their early years together, but confident that their world was secure and their future bright. 3 years later, the quarry had become a pilgrimage site for scientists from around the world, a place where the boundaries between physics and music, between geology and art, were explored by researchers who came to understand that nature held wonders that transcended traditional academic categories. Evelyn had completed her doctorate based on her work with the phonoluminescent crystals and had established a permanent research station on the property, working closely with Arthur to ensure that the scientific work honored the spirit of preservation that had motivated his father's original secrecy. The small team of researchers who lived and worked on the site had become like family to Arthur, sharing meals and stories and celebrations in a way that reminded him of the best aspects of military camaraderie without the constant threat of danger. The singing stones, as they had become known in the scientific literature, had yielded insights into crystalline formation, acoustic resonance, and bioluminescence that were revolutionizing multiple fields of study. But more than their scientific value, they had become a symbol of the idea that some treasures were worth protecting even when their value was not immediately apparent, that patience and wisdom sometimes required saying no to profit in favor of preservation. Arthur had become an unofficial spokesman for this philosophy, speaking at conferences and universities about the balance between progress and conservation, between individual rights and collective responsibility. Rex accompanied him on many of these trips, having become as much a part of the story as Arthur himself, a living reminder that loyalty and courage came in many forms, and that the most important battles were often fought not for glory or recognition, but for love and duty and the simple belief that right should triumph over wrong. The property itself had been transformed from a private retreat into a model of sustainable development, where scientific research, environmental protection, and community engagement worked together to create something greater than any of them could have achieved in isolation. Visitors came not only to see the crystals, but to experience a place where human wisdom and natural wonder existed in harmony, where the mistakes of the past had been transformed into lessons for the future. On quiet evenings when the researchers had gone home and the visitors had departed, Arthur and Rex would often walk to the quarry entrance and sit in comfortable silence, listening to the faint harmonies that emerged when the wind was just right and the crystals caught the resonance of distant sounds. It was during one of these evening vigils that Arthur found the words that would serve as his father's true epitaph and his own guiding philosophy. True courage isn't just about facing danger, but about defending what you love against the ghosts of the past. The phrase captured something essential about their journey, about the way that love and duty could transform fear into strength and isolation into connection. Arthur had learned that heroism was not about seeking conflict or proving oneself in battle, but about standing firm when standing was required, about choosing protection over profit and principle over convenience. Rex, now graying around the muzzle but still alert and devoted, seemed to understand the significance of these moments. Positioning himself close to Arthur's side and gazing out over the land they had fought to preserve, as if he too was contemplating the meaning of their shared adventure. The bond between them had deepened through trials that most partnerships never faced, creating a connection that transcended the usual relationship between human and animal to become something approaching true partnership. They had saved each other in ways that went beyond the obvious drama of their physical confrontation with Silas, each providing the other with purpose and meaning that transformed survival into something approaching wisdom. If this story of resilience and justice resonated with you, please subscribe to ensure these important voices are heard. The next chapter of bravery is waiting for you on the screen right now. Click to continue the journey. We thank you for supporting our veterans and the incredible animals who stand by them. Loyalty often reveals itself in the most unexpected ways. What heroic act has your pet ever done for you? Share your story with us in the comments below and help us celebrate the unbreakable bonds that make life worth defending.